Millions of shared hosting sites were being actively compromised before the patch even existed. That's not a hypothetical threat model. That's the actual timeline here. Let's talk about what's happening with this cPanel vulnerability, why it's operationally significant beyond the usual critical CVE noise, and what you need to do right now if you run anything on shared hosting infrastructure or manage clients who do. CISA added a cPanel security flaw to its known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, which is the agency's way of saying this isn't theoretical. They have confirmed evidence of active exploitation in the wild. The KEV catalog doesn't get updated on vibes. When something lands there, it means real attackers are using it against real targets. That's the baseline you need to hold in your head. The detail that makes this worse than a standard critical CVE is the timeline. Exploitation was underway before patches landed. That means this was either a 0-day being actively traded and used, or the vulnerability window between discovery and patch was long enough that threat actors got there first. The reporting from the register indicates at least one victim has already received a ransomware demand. So we're past the patch before it gets bad window. We are in the assess whether you've already been hit window. cPanel, for anyone who hasn't had the displeasure of dealing with it at scale, is the dominant web hosting control panel on the internet. It's the thing that runs underneath a massive portion of shared hosting, reseller hosting, and small to mid-tier managed hosting products. When vendors say millions of sites potentially exposed, that's not marketing inflation. The actual install base of cPanel across hosting providers globally is enormous. We're talking about a piece of software that sits on the same server as your customer's WordPress site, their email, their DNS configuration, their file system, and often their database credentials. It's a very wide blast radius per compromised host. The specific CVE details are worth unpacking as far as the reporting allows. The vulnerability is described as critical, which in CVSS terms typically means a score of 9, 0 or above. The register's reporting confirms exploitation is active and that ransomware operators are involved. But the precise technical mechanism, whether this is a remote code execution flaw, an authentication bypass, a privilege escalation chain, or something else, is unclear from the reporting as of the time this was written. That matters because the exploitation method affects your detection strategy. An auth bypass looks different in your logs than an RCE. Until cPanel or a credible third-party researcher publishes a full technical breakdown, you're working with partial information, and you should treat it accordingly. What we do know is that cPanel has released patches. The question is whether your hosting provider has applied them, and this is where the shared hosting model creates a genuinely ugly operational problem. When you're on shared hosting or managing clients you don't control the patch cycle. You're dependent on your hosting provider's update cadence. Some providers are good at this. Many are not. The economic incentives in the shared hosting market don't reward aggressive patching. They reward uptime and low support ticket volume, and patches sometimes break things. So the first concrete action here is straightforward. If you or your clients use cPanel-based hosting, contact the hosting provider today and ask them directly which version of cPanel they are running and whether they have applied the patches addressing this vulnerability. Get that answer in writing if you can. If they can't tell you, or if they give you a vague, "we take security seriously" non-answer, treat that as a red flag about the provider's operational maturity, not just about this specific incident. The second thing to understand is what ransomware involvement signals about the attacker profile. Ransomware gangs are not the most sophisticated threat actors, but they are operationally efficient. When they show up in the early exploitation window of a critical vulnerability, it usually means one of two things. Either the vulnerability is easy enough to weaponize that commodity ransomware operators picked it up quickly, or there's a working exploit being sold or shared in criminal markets that lowered the barrier to entry. Either scenario means the exploitation volume is going to increase, not decrease, over the coming weeks. The early victim reporting is not the peak. It's the beginning of the curve. For anyone running a hosting business or managing infrastructure that includes cPanel hosts, the incident response posture right now should include a few things. First, check your cPanel version. The current patched versions should be visible in your WHM interface. If you're not on the latest release track, you need to understand why and fix that. cPanel has a stable, release, and current tier, Most production systems run stable, which sometimes lags on security patches. That trade-off looks different when there's an actively exploited critical CVE in play. Second, review your access logs for cPanel and WHM going back at least 30 days. Look for authentication attempts from unusual IP ranges, privilege escalation patterns, unexpected cron job creation, and any new SSH keys or authorized keys file modifications. If attackers have been in your environment before the patch doesn't evict them. You need to look for persistence mechanisms. Third, if you're a managed service provider with clients on shared hosting platforms you don't control, this is a good moment to have an honest conversation about hosting architecture. Shared hosting is cheap for a reason. The security model is fundamentally different from a VPS or dedicated instance where you control the software stack. For clients who have any meaningful data or business continuity requirements, the cost delta between shared hosting and a small managed VPS is often trivial compared to the incident response cost of a ransomware event. There's a broader structural point worth making here. cPanel has been the dominant hosting control panel for decades. It's deeply embedded in the hosting industry's economics and tooling. It's also a large, complex piece of software with a significant attack surface, running with elevated privileges on systems that host enormous numbers of websites. The security record is not terrible, but critical vulnerabilities in cPanel are not rare events. This is at least the third time in recent years that a cPanel flaw has made it to CISA KEV list. The pattern is established. If you're building infrastructure or advising on it, the question of whether cPanel is the right long-term choice for anything above the most basic use case is worth asking seriously. Alternatives like Plesk, direct admin, or fully containerized approaches exist. None of them are perfect, but diversifying away from a monoculture that represents millions of potential targets is a legitimate risk management consideration. One more thing on the media coverage angle. Most of the tech press coverage of this story has been fairly close to the CISA announcement and the Register's original reporting. That's actually fine. This is a story where the primary source is solid and the news is straightforward. What you want to avoid is the secondary wave of coverage that will frame this as a reason to buy some vendor's web application firewall or hosting security product. A WAF does not protect you from a server-side cPanel vulnerability being exploited before the patch exists. The marketing will imply otherwise. It's wrong. The real takeaway here is operational and immediate. Find every cPanel-based host in your environment or your client's environments. Verify the patch status with the provider directly. If you can't get a clear answer, assume you're unpatched. Review logs for signs of compromise going back at least a month. And if you find anything anomalous, treat it as a potential pre-patch intrusion, not just a failed login attempt.